Okay, just to mark the recording, it is February 4th, 2024. And today we're going to start with a little presentation. And when our guest, Ambassador John Simon, is in a comfortable place, he will come in at any point he wants. Now, some of you challenged me last time, I'm meeting your challenge, to develop a series of slides and comments on individuals in the United States who followed George Kennan. Let me get this on the screen. Um, I'm calling this Kennan's Times and Successors. This is America-centric, everybody, and very admittedly so. But somebody suggested, we've talked quite a bit about George Kennan and, what comes simultaneous and after George Kennan. Good question. You got me really working, and I thought I would mention two or three, but as you see, it ended up being 7 or 8. Let me get rid of that. And I'm not claiming that these individuals are disciples of Kennan or that they followed his suggestion, but some of them were coterminous, like Reinhold Niebuhr, Hans Morgenthau. Some of them came later, but they all were involved in something called grand strategy. I hope you like my cartoon there. Um, the two military people, supposedly enemies, are following a pattern and developing a strategy. Let me take care. Sorry, have to call you back in an hour. Sorry. Um, so what the theme of our fall program really was strategy and grand strategy as the instrument we use when we're looking at a crisis. This can be an international crisis or local or personal. In discussing this, there are these abstract terms which we overuse because nobody is a pure realist or a pure idealist. These things don't exist in the real world. People are a combination. Everybody I've ever met who deals with strategy or policy describes themselves as a realist. And yet there's another side, obviously. There is the mirror image of realism. These are concepts we could benefit by looking at these directly just for a moment. The realist, as you know, I just thought I would put it down on in a slide. The realist believes that the human being, there are limits to the goodness, the generosity of human beings when they're faced with resource shortages, for example. They turn to survival. Survival very often will be a higher priority than doing good acts. And realists tend to, the realists who've written on this topic, and we're going to get to Hans Morgenthau in a minute, who wrote the book on realism. These are people generally whose lives were marked by conflict. Hans Morgenthau, a Jewish immigrant from Germany, shortly after World War II, wrote the book, which we'll get to in a moment, because of his belief that came through real experience that people maybe have an element of goodness, but don't depend on it. That's basically where he comes from. He's a hard realist who believes that human nature, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but you cannot rely on it. And there's a sound logical basis for this school. We're talking about a high priority placed on survival, self-preservation, the belief that human nature is unchangeable, that the biological needs we have, the need for safety, the need for community, these are things which are, these are not variables. These are things that people always have. And people who are strategists, if they are public officials, this is a very important point. This school of thought says that a person, let's say a president, a prime minister, a dictator, Their task is not to be fair or humanistic or to be generous, but the task is to protect the sovereign state that that person directs. Realists will always say, regardless of morality, the leader of a country who accepts this responsibility must act in the interests of that country. That will not always coincide with their own beliefs about ethics and morality. We'll get to Morgenthau's 6 principles. And
Hey,
then,
Dan,
yes, John.
I do want, I mean, again, it's sort of awkward for me to be interceding from the car, but I do want to just make a point because I think you rightfully claim that you've never met someone who claimed they weren't a realist. And I think
Um,
that's largely true. But actually, during the Bush administration, I would have to say we definitely thought that we were combating the realists in the, who would tell us that there's, that change in the Middle East was impossible. And
yes.
we, most of the folks, if you read the national security strategy of 2002 or 2006, it was very much a strategy that put itself as a counterpoint to the sort of traditional realist approach.
Yep. Thank you, John. But what you've just said moves me to jump 5 slides ahead to this chart. This is just a way of thinking of things. Charts are scientific and human beings are not scientific. But if we look at where people belong, everybody in the world belongs somewhere on this chart. As you see, we have idealism. This is arbitrarily put at the top of the chart, realism at the bottom. If people are internationalist and who advocate actions overseas or with other countries, we call them internationalists. If they are isolationist or non-interventionist, we call them non-interventionists. As you see, there are 4 points on this graph. What John Simon has just referred to is, and I hope I'm not cheapening the idea, John, this is just a term. We don't know
Yeah.
what to call it, but what John Simon has just described is a way of thinking that does not fit. It does not fit in this chart. And I think you'll see in a moment, if I go to the next screen, examples, non-interventionism, idealism, John Quincy Adams. We have no demons to pursue in other countries. The idea that we're best off just staying with ourselves, never mind the conflicts in foreign countries, just deal with what we have in our country. And he's described as these are all, again, imperfect words. Other idealists, on the contrary, were very interested in having some influence on foreign affairs. And sometimes we use these examples of President Wilson, Jimmy Carter, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, if we go to the other quadrant of this graph, we have non-interventionist realists. Examples could be George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ron Paul. Ron Paul is probably a good example of someone who truly wants not to be involved in adventures or even in policy overseas. George Washington, when he left his first and only term, was very clear that he wanted the United States at its beginning point to be mainly focused on itself. And then we have the others, the opposite, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, who were indeed realists, but also interventionists. Now, I have what John Simon has just mentioned, and forgive me if I use this word loosely, neoconservatism. John, the neoconservative way of looking at things, which John Simon has just described, doesn't really belong on this graph, because as he just pointed out, there were elements of idealism in what they advocated. These three are those who collectively decided to do military intervention in Iraq in March of 2002. I've put a question marks by George W. Bush because much later in this presentation, you'll see that it's either Brzezinski or Scowcroft who says, no, he wasn't really a neoconservative. He was open to all ideas. I think it's Scowcroft who said, don't think of George Bush as an idealist or as a realist or as an internationalist. He was obviously, he came into office not particularly focused on foreign affairs, but obviously became very focused after 9/11. So maybe this chart, I don't know if this is helpful. Oh, John is on the phone. He's not looking at he can't see the chart.
Yeah, I'm not. I
Well,
can't see the chart. From what you described, I would have thought you could place, the Bush administration clearly in the internationalist idealist camp. But there may be some elements of that you would find issue with. I mean, like I say, from the perspective where we were, we definitely felt ourselves as more focused on international engagement, both in the defense security sense, but also in the trade and the development finance and foreign aid sense than a lot of our opponents. But we also felt our opponents were tended to look at the world as it was and not as it could be. Now, we never necessarily achieved all we thought the world could be, but we definitely did feel that we were trying to contest with both isolationists and so-called realists.
yes, thank you very much for that. And maybe I should redo this chart, but when you see the chart, John, you'll see that I put this camp way to the right of the chart under the interventionist or internationalist side. And for everybody else, obviously these are abstractions. It's just a way of organizing one's thinking. I think John would agree that they go to the side of the chart, which is internationalist. The reason they are sometimes removed from the four quadrants was, I believe, because they had elements both of realism and idealism. And so, in fact, they created a whole new way of thinking about international affairs. Thanks, John. And someday I'll show you the chart and you'll see. If you think I should redo it, I'll gladly do so.
No, but I think that's absolutely right. Because while I think we thought of ourselves as combating realists, we definitely didn't think of ourselves as pure idealists. We thought, changing the world required some, tough choices, and we thought we didn't shy away from those. But again, history will pass judgment on how effective all that was.
And for everybody's benefit, John Simon was the ambassador to the African Union at that time, and later or earlier was with the National Security Council. So
earlier.
So
yeah. Go ahead.
He really knows best. He really knows best how to think of these. Again, I'm creating abstractions. It's just a way of, you can identify yourself. If everybody looks at this chart, I'll show John it later. Nobody is in the exact middle. You see the crossing point here of the two lines, which obviously are hand-drawn. This is not a scientific chart, but everybody in the world is either a little bit this way or a little bit that way. And also everybody in the world would change according to circumstances. I think George W. Bush is a perfect example of someone who went into office with a certain mindset and who changed very considerably after 9/11. So going back a bit, idealists would say we are opposed to realists. We don't believe that human beings are static in their in the way they act and think. They are perfectible. They are changeable. They believe that sovereignty is what it is, but they think in terms of a higher reality. We call it evolution, something that takes us to a higher level of human organization beyond and above sovereignty. They believe that empathy is a real thing. They believe that through empathy and creative dialogue, it is possible to change the mindset and the behavior of other people. They tend to believe in negotiation rather than conflict. And this quote, humanity has common interests. and must find common solutions. Um, and John, whenever you're able to join, we'll just leave this chart. But let's go to one step further until you are able to come in. The question some of you raised was, well, we spent some time looking at George Kennan. Was he a realist? Was he an idealist? And I'm saying it's complicated. He certainly was an idealist in his belief that the United States, which he had big issues with American culture, American commerce, and capitalism, but he, after you go through all the diaries and all the biographies, it seems as if he had a genuine belief in the goodness of the American people. He didn't like them all the time, but he often referred to their decency. And by the way, he had the same feeling about Russian citizens. Certainly not the Russian government. He hated Stalin, but he had a belief that people universally, if they remain true to their values, and that's Kennan's main message, if America can remain true to its values, it will prevail over the Soviet Union. So even with our basic example, Kennan, you see there's a mixture. There will always be a mixture of these elements. And I don't want to exaggerate the academic side of this. It's just a way of thinking. You can identify any person who's active in dealing with crises as belonging somewhere on this graph, okay? And again, I'm willing to redo this, but this comes from a colleague, Christian Meisch, who actually conceived of the chart in this way. We don't have to believe every bit of it. Again, it's just a way of helping us think about where do famous individuals, and ourselves for that matter, where do we fit in this graph? Now, if we look at realism as a school, people who study international relations usually consider Hans Morgenthau as the urtext on this subject. He was a Jewish immigrant from Germany. He was very well aware of the bad things that had happened in World War II, and he came firmly convinced that a nation must defend itself. The responsibility of the head of state of a nation is not really rooted in, because morality and ethics, these things are loosely defined. How can you be certain that your opinion about ethics and morality is valid? He distrusts morality and ethics as a basis for international action. He wrote, and this is just a reference that anybody on this call should be familiar with, the 6 principles of political realism. Guys, this is quite academic, and I'm going to go over it very lightly and proceed beyond. But, and I put in bold here some of the key phrases. International relations students, I don't know if this is still true. They all, in the decades ago, all of them would read Hans Morgenthau as the one most able to articulate the realist arguments, okay? And there are, I showed you some examples of people who strongly disagree with him. Eleanor Roosevelt would be such a person. He has 6 principles. It sounds very scientific, very academic, very organized. Political realism believes that politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. You see this highlighted. And of course, in Morgenthau's view, human nature was not good, it was not bad, certainly was not purely good, but it was motivated by the need for certain resources. And in that sense, human beings, you can compare them to other animals, mammals, that don't necessarily act according to morality or ethics, but because they're hungry or because they need shelter. This is not crazy, this point of view, but Morgenthau is one of the few examples that we know who really was purely a realist. He really did not mix these different elements. He has the 6 points, which, you can do a PhD thesis on this very, very briefly. The 6 points. Number one, objective laws have their roots in human nature. He does not see human nature as something good necessarily. It can be, but don't rely on it. Secondly, interest is defined in terms of power. And he defines power as the ability to oblige other people to do what you want them to do. Now, again, that sounds very inhuman. It sounds very mechanical. But again, this is an individual who saw in Europe, he was very persuaded that morality and ethics fell apart during the Holocaust and during the Stalin period. And he was very personally marked by these things and believed you can believe in human nature as something good, but you're safer and you're on more certain grounds if you do not depend on human nature as being good or well motivated. Number 3, and here he quotes Thucydides. So that he quotes way back in history to support his argument. Thucydides, this is a real quote. The identity of interest is the surest of bonds, whether between states or individuals. And Morgenthau picks up Lord Salisbury in the United Kingdom, who goes by the same principle. He's trying to establish his bona fides, right? Salisbury said, the only bond of union that endures is the absence of all clashing interests. It has nothing to do with friendship, inclinations, positive inclinations, not even ethnic identity. It's only this, I don't know what word to use other than realism. If your interests are similar to mine, we can work together. If we become friends, great. But being friends is not the justification for working together, because friendships come and go. And we'll talk about the opposite in a moment. Point number 4, the tension between the moral command and the requirements of successful political action maintains that universal moral principles cannot be applied in the acts of states. Does Morgenthau not believe in moral principles? Yes, he does. He does believe in them, but he believes that these are things that can move an individual to act correctly or to act with decency, whereas a state, a government, is an abstraction. A state cannot have morality. A person can have morality. This is meant to challenge everybody, and I'm guessing everybody on this call is scratching their head and saying, what in the world? But this is the most complete articulation of realism that I think we've had. The 5th point of 6, political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. He believes that no human being can or should even attempt to see morality as something intrinsic in nature. Morality is something that comes from human beings. It's superimposed. He's not minimizing morality, but he's just saying the actions that get to a successful resolution of a crisis cannot depend on the belief that there's in nature or in the divine plan that there's something called morality. Again, he says this because of his own observation of Europe during World War II. And then 6 of the 6, the political realist maintains the autonomy of the political sphere and interest defined as power. And at the end of his introductory chapter, the book is quite long. The first chapter puts out the 6 principles. And he says, he compares the political realist to other professions. And this is intriguing. I put it in bold. The economist asks, how does the policy affect the wealth of a society? That's the job of the economist. The lawyer says, is this policy in accord with the rules of law. Now, rules of law do not come from some divine presence. They come from human beings who are trying to reconcile differences and to create a legal system that will pacify or suppress conflict. So the lawyer says, is this policy in accord with the rules of law? Not the rules of nature, the rules of law, which is man-made. The moralist will say, is this policy in accord with moral principles? Perfectly valid question if you are a moralist. But Morgenthau is not. He's a political realist. So his question is, how does this policy affect the power of a nation? Power is everything. It sounds ugly. It sounds materialistic. But take it for what it is. Morgenthau develops this idea very thoroughly. Now, let's look at another example of a contemporary, early 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr. We've talked about him before. I've put him, I'm not sure where to put him exactly, and I think he himself would have said, well, I'm an idealist and I'm also a realist. You see how these things can be. Morgenthau is the only pure example of anything that I know of. Eleanor Roosevelt was an idealist. Reinhold Niebuhr, a Protestant practitioner who went to divinity school at Yale and became a major and profound influence on U.S. foreign policy, was a mixture, in my opinion, was a mixture of idealism and realism, lived until 1971. And in his book, The Moral Man and the Immoral Society, you see how this has elements of idealism and realism. He stressed, I'm reading here, I stressed the egoism and the pride and the hypocrisy of nations and classes. Original sin to him was the failure to understand our own limits. And this extended into foreign policy as the understanding that the more we intervene in foreign affairs, especially in conflict, the more likely we are to make mistakes. We know the Serenity Prayer. God, give us the courage to change what must be altered, the serenity to accept which cannot be helped, and the insight to know the one from the other. I think we're all familiar with this. In his book, The Irony of American History, 1952, he created a belief system which became the main motivator of Barack Obama. When Obama said, don't do stupid stuff, what he really said was stupid shit. We know that Obama was profoundly influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr. Overextension. We've talked previously, Napoleon was stupid when he took 500,000 troops and tried to conquer Russia. This was an overextension. It was the failure to understand what your limits are. And Obama was very marked by this. He said a few times, it's Reinhold Niebuhr. He's my lodestar. He is the reasoning behind my actions. We all remember Obama was very reluctant to get involved in conflicts overseas. The famous red line on Syria. He was personally averse to being part of a conflict overseas. When the United States joined France and England in military intervention into Libya because Muammar Gaddafi had said he was going to eliminate, he was going to kill everybody at the other side in Benghazi. And the French and the British persuaded Hillary Clinton that there should be an intervention in order to save people from extermination. The United Nations principle R2P, responsibility to protect, was the motivation of Hillary Clinton's belief that the US should join France and the UK in preventing Gaddafi from killing his own people. Now, we do know that Obama did not want to be involved in Libya, but that Madeleine Albright, after hectoring him and arguing with him and preaching, finally he agreed. Reluctantly, he agreed with Hillary Clinton's strong argument that the U.S. become involved in its responsibility to protect. We know how it started. We know how it ended. It ended very badly. And that doesn't prove that Reinhold Niebuhr is always correct or that Obama is always correct, but it does show that overextension, going beyond your actual abilities, this is something a realist never does. A realist is highly cognizant of the limits of what they can do. So here we just have an example. Again, I'm not counting on Niebuhr as a disciple of Kennan. I believe that they did know each other and they had interesting exchanges of views. Individuals always, again, they don't belong very neatly and directly in one of these four schools, but they are motivated by that way of thinking when they make their arguments. Now, we get to a little bit later. Again, these are not disciples of Kennan, but all of these people are very, very aware of Kennan and his success in predicting the downfall of the Soviet Union. Here's a picture of Brzezinski with my students. These were my students. I got him to greet some of the students that I had some years ago. Brzezinski, the relationship between Brzezinski and Scowcroft was fascinating because Brzezinski, I would say, a realist. He was Democrat. He worked for Jimmy Carter. And I believe I think I would say, curious if John agrees, I think Brzezinski was much more of a hawk, much more of a realist than his boss was. Carter, human rights policy. Carter was the Carter Center, obviously, even to this day, very much in favor of promoting democracy, which I think I would put in the idealist motivation. So you had this paradox. And a president, Jimmy Carter, more or less a dove, and his national security advisor, born in Poland and became quite a hawk. I'm guessing that Brzezinski probably read and absorbed Hans Morgenthau. They were both Europeans. One of them came from Hitlerian Germany. The other came from communist Poland. And so they came to the United States understanding the dangers in Europe of the exaggeration. Both of them, I think, thought of Americans as somewhat naive. And then on the other side, also paradoxical, you had Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor for President Ford and the Bush Sr., he was not an idealist, but he was not the hard, hawkish realist that Brzezinski was. Again, these are some of my students. I wish you had been there at the time. Scowcroft was a very charming guy, and he loved mingling with people. You see his benign smile. He was so happy to be with students.
It's
Yes, John.
interesting, Dan. I mean, from my perspective, and again, I have a tremendous amount of admiration for Scowcroft, but Scowcroft was very much in the realist camp.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying otherwise. Right.
Yeah, and like I say, it is funny because I do think that like you say, Carter was very much idealist. Brzezinski was very much realist. But it's funny how things change with the changing in circumstances. So as I point out, while Scowcroft, and I think by and large you could think of the Bush 41 administration as largely a realist dominated thought. I do think you would think of Bush 43 as largely dominated by an idealist approach that got tempered over time with realism.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Now that John Simon is live on the screen, let's turn directly to him and let me point out. I haven't read every page of this, John, but this is John Simon's. He worked with a team in the Bush Jr. Obama transition, and I have mentioned to the group, John, that that this is a uniquely American thing. I believe that the
At
formal.
least it was.
Well, it was before Trump. Trump did not have a transition.
Yeah.
But this is not a law, it's a tradition, but it's a very strong tradition in American history that when, after an election, when one party replaces another, there's a very cordial, productive process called transition. And John's article, this is a book done by many people. John's article begins on page 469. And I think partly because of John having been U.S. ambassador in the African Union, there's quite a bit about Africa in this paper. And I believe that most Africans, when they look at presidents of the United States in the past, the one they really admire is George W. Bush. And John Simon's going to explain why.
Well, first off, so talk a little bit about the transitions. I think there have been many different flavors of transition over the course of American history. The President George W. Bush was committed to make sure that his transition would be as seamless as possible. He believed strongly in that one of the strengths of our country was our ability to have a peaceful transfer of power, and he believed, he was proud of what we had accomplished in foreign policy during his time, but he wanted to make sure that as much as possible, the incoming administration understood what we had done, where we saw the challenges, and could prepare for those. So there were a series of memos that so just to be clear, the office within the White House that focuses on national security is called the National Security Staff, which works for the National Security Council, which is basically all the cabinet secretaries that are interested in national security. And that group, it's grown over the years. When I was on the national security staff, I think we had probably, not counting the people who sort of, worked in the situation room and monitored what was happening around the world, we probably had about 200 professionals. I think it's probably more than that now. They're divided both in terms of regional directorates and then functional directorates. I was in the functional directorate that focused on what we called relief, stabilization, and development. That later got, the Obama administration, that directorate was named the Directorate for Global Development. So it's heavily focused on our foreign aid and foreign investment policies. But what President Bush did is he asked the National Security Council staff to prepare a series of memos for their for the incoming administration on all the issues that they felt were most important. And as you can see from that book, it's a lot. I think it's 40 or so. Yep. And then those were all classified memos, obviously, so they couldn't be shared publicly. But when they became declassified 10 years later, so 2018, Stephen Hadley, who was President Bush's national security advisor, wanted to sort of highlight how, the value of those memos, and also how those memos sort of stood the test of time. So he basically asked a number of us to write what we called postscripts that were sort of looking at what had actually happened and compare that to what we had thought would happen, and identify where we got things right and where we may have missed, and what and if we did miss, why we may have been off. And that's that compendium of memos plus postscripts is the book.
Yeah, let me
Dan's holding up.
Let me highlight a couple because I deal with Africa. PEPFAR and MCC were fantastic innovations done during the Bush Jr. administration. It's your memo 10 years later highlights this. Can you tell us? I mean, I work with Africans all the time. they loved George W. Bush because of PEPFAR, MPC, and other countries. Can you tell us, did these achievements exceed your expectations?
Oh, well, so if you think of, um, there are three major global initiatives that I was involved with. One was the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. One was the President's Malaria Initiative, and one was the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Starting with the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, we had very specific targets on that, the 3, 7, 10 targets. So we were supposed to treat 3 million people, prevent 7 million new infections, and care for 10 million orphans who had been orphaned by parents who had gotten AIDS. It's now 20 years later. So the first that was in the first 5 years were the targets. We actually hit those targets. But now, 20 years later, 25 million people basically owe their lives to PEPFAR, which I think far exceeds anything that we could have imagined at the time. And I think if you look at at the time, the damage that AIDS was doing to the fabric of African society was just, unimaginable. And in fact, that damage has largely been contained. Now the battle is nowhere near won. And one thing that's happened is now PEPFAR, which for the first 20 years of existence was incredibly bipartisan, now has become there's now a partisan debate over whether to reauthorize it or not, which is really unfortunate because the job is not done. But it's had a very, very good 20-year run. If you look at the President's Malaria Initiative, at the time that we launched that, 1 million people were dying of malaria every year, most of those children under 5. After the first sort of round of the President's Malaria Initiative, that had been cut down from 1 million to 500,000. And then we sort of plateaued at 500, 400,000. And now, thanks to, among other things, climate change, we're beginning to see that number tick up because obviously containing malaria is partly about avoiding having standing water in lots of places. And with climate change, it's now tougher to fight having standing water. So there's a lot more work to be done there. But that, again, saving 500,000 largely children a year, mostly in Africa, that was a major accomplishment. And then if you look at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, overall, the countries that were part of the Millennium Challenge Corporation that got the benefit, and basically the Millennium Challenge Corporation was an aid initiative that said, look, if country, one of the big challenges of foreign aid is coming into a country and saying, it's a principal agent problem. We have all the money, we want you to do X. And the country says, well, X isn't so important to us, we'd rather do Y. And then the donor says, no, X is important to me, you must do X. And if you look at all the literature around foreign aid, one of the most important indicators of success with foreign aid is whether the local country owns the program, whether they're vested in it. And in many foreign aid programs, that link is broken because the donor says we want to do something, and the people in the country have a very different idea of what's important to them. The idea of the MCC was to say, look, let's identify countries where we can have faith that the governments are making good decisions for their people. Let's trust them to develop the program. Let's make the resources very large, so this could be a program that really moves the needle, and then we'll give them the resources to help them do that. And so to qualify for the MCC, you had to score above average in both in governance, economic policy, and social policy. And by above average, we looked at third-party indicators, not U.S. government indicators, and said, did a country, we basically started with 18 indicators, and basically six in governance, what we call voice and vote, 6 in economic policy, and 6 in social policy. And if a government was above average on 3 of those in each category, they could qualify. So it wasn't a hugely high bar, but it was, something that surprisingly a number of countries, to be above average consistently was not an easy thing for countries to do. So the first group of MCC countries were about 15, I think about half in Africa. Some of those countries, got mired in things like coups and civil strife, like Madagascar, and really weren't able to realize the full potential. Others, like Ghana, another one that was a promising one for a while, now is mired in a coup, is Mali. But others like Ghana or Lesotho actually progressed quite well. Namibia. I would say the MCC overall, the whole cohort of countries, have grown very well, have seen real positive advancements in governance. Most of them remain democracies, but certainly there are a number of examples of countries that have fallen off track, and that's part of the challenge of work of frontier markets is that for things to go well in development, a lot of things have to go right. For things to go poorly, maybe just one or two things need to go badly. And a lot of these countries faced serious challenges in those one or two things.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know that Africans love MCC if they got the benefit of MCC. That's a minority of countries because they have to meet these baseline requirements. As I understand it, the traditional aid organization, U.S. Agency for International Development, has more money available worldwide. But as John has pointed out, if you're lucky enough to have an MCC compact, you get a lot, you get a significant amount. Now, here's a challenge question, John. I remember I'm haunted by a conversation I had with a Togolese visitor from Togo. He said, my government doesn't meet any of these standards. I hate my government. Why are you punishing me? How do you answer a thing like that?
So the theory of MCC wasn't, at the end of the day, it did reward some countries and, by default punish others. But the idea was, how do we spend more aid effectively? And a lot of research, including sort of the famous research by David Dollar, and I can't remember who at the World Bank, and I can't remember who his co-author was, sort of indicated that if you put aid into countries that have sounder policies and institutions, you're going to get much more benefit from it. Right. So it was really about saying to that person, look, we don't want to waste money in a place where it's not going to be effective. We want to put it where it's going to make a difference. And unfortunately, for our aid to be effective in Togo, especially around these issues, we need to see a lot of improvements in the policy environment.
Pedagogically, I should just say, we have two people involved in development who despise each other, Jeffrey Sachs and William Easterly. Sachs has said in his was kind of the first major book on this topic, and he said to reduce, it's a reductionist thing to say, but basically he said, we're not doing enough. We need to double our efforts. William Easterly, who despises Jeffrey Sachs, said, you're wasting your time if you do something in a country that has no elements of democracy. And I really enjoy seeing these two take potshots at each other because these are opposing views. Both of them have merit. I don't know where you belong, but what you've described, John, as the virtues of MCC, I would guess that William Easterly would very much support the model that you're talking about, and Sachs would not. What do you think about that?
So actually, it's a little bit of the reverse, but for different reasons. So because MCC had a very big number, Sachs was very supportive of the idea of putting lots of, trying to do big things with aid, which we tried to do. He was somewhat critical of the measurement metrics, and he absolutely did not think that aid should be contingent on the policy environments in which they were. But he liked the idea that if this was the way to get aid to be significant, his underlying theory was development requires massive transfer of resources. And this seems to be putting a lot more resources into play. Bill Easterly was skeptical of the compact concept. So part of the idea of the MCC is you work with the country to develop a plan. And if you read Bill Easterly's work, he divides the development world into planners and seekers. Yep. And planners sort of come up with these grand plans, which he says almost always fail. What you want is seekers, sort of people working at the ground level who are trying something out here, trying something out there. And that's sort of his idea of the more effective development. I would argue MCC made room in many of its compacts for those types of seekers. And that, a big part of what you're trying to solve, which the planners tend to create create the big problem of is this, like I say, this principal agent problem. And so part of what you need to figure out is how do you get resources to the people who are actually dealing with the problem as directly as possible, which is something I think MCC was trying to do. But Bill Easterly, he liked the metrics piece. He was somewhat skeptical of the idea of these big compacts that were, negotiated between high officials in the governments and MCC, and would much more preferred a more distributed model where the resources went to, this group here that's working on female entrepreneurship, and that group there that's working on water and sanitation or something like that, and find a way to empower the people who are closest to the problems to solve them, which I also believe is an important element. I mean, part of what I do today, which we didn't talk about, I'm now in the business of trying to mobilize investment capital into frontier markets, having spent a fair bit of time at what is now called the Development Finance Corporation, which is the U.S. government's development bank. And part of that is because part of the way I believe that you make a difference is you give resources to the entrepreneurs who are at the bottom of the pyramid trying to solve problems.
Well, that's one of the three questions I was about to ask you, but let's give my two others were, how did you do, looking back, how successful were those programs and others?
I mean, like I said, if you look at the pure numbers, PEPFAR, PMI, MCC were incredibly successful. PEPFAR probably more than anyone could imagine. MCC had a few setbacks, but overall the population did quite well. But where did it do well? There were some exogenous factors we didn't anticipate. So one issue is the sort of the growth of China as a factor in development, with a real emphasis on a more transactional than long-term approach to development, at some level undermined what we were trying to do with the compacts. And then I would argue, to the extent, other donors and eventually us became more transactional and less focused on long-term development, that too undermined, our compacts. So I do think that part of the challenge was sticking to the knitting, and again, we were a big donor, but we're only one donor of many, and having all the resources that are on the donor side trying to point towards the same ultimate objectives. That's part of what really is required to make these models successful.
So let's get to what interests me the most. I must say, we do want to hear about the African Union.
By the way, I only have 5 minutes, Dan. I don't know.
Okay, I didn't know that. If during these 5 minutes, tell us what you're doing now, because it's so fascinating. And how did you create and get involved in this?
Well, so as I pointed out, I was working in the leadership of our Development Finance Bank. And the Development Finance Bank, what then was called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, is now called the Development Finance Corporation, was really set up to help U.S. businesses do business in emerging market countries and frontier markets by providing them with political risk insurance, so that if there was a problem, like a expropriation or a civil war, there was someone who would take that risk, which most of the private market wouldn't, or providing them with financing, because typically there weren't a lot of financiers who were willing to go long term in frontier markets. But what we found over time is that the political risks tended to be overstated, so there was a lot less interest in political risk insurance, and that our corporations could access capital markets for most of the financing they need, our big corporations. So where the real need was in the high impact type of interventions, sort of what microfinance does, for instance, or what sort of renewables mini grids do, sort of solar mini grids, or things or water systems for rural areas. And so what we found is that there was this whole world of what's now called impact investors, where investors were interested in using an investment model to create real positive change, but were not, but were as interested or more interested in the impact than they were the financial return. And at DFC, we began to fund more and more of those types of projects. And then when I left DFC, that's the type of work that I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we created Total Impact Capital to basically help finance high impact interventions, largely in the basic human needs space: health, food, water, sanitation, education, things like that around the world.
Two questions. You probably have time to answer only one. First, what is it that motivates you to do this? And second, how does the multinational development banks, the NDBs like the World Bank, they want to work with the private sector. How's that going?
Yeah. So first off, what motivates me, I should say what motivates us. I mean, we have a team here of a whole lot of people who many of whom, and this was true when I was at DFC, left much better paying jobs in Wall Street to sort of spend time in places like El Salvador or Honduras or Ethiopia, trying to figure out how to get capital to people who could really use that capital to make a difference in people's lives. And I would say, like all those people, I find that to be one of the best rewards you could have in the time you spent during the day trying to get the day.
And the World Bank wants the private sector to be in tandem with them. Does that ever work?
So World Bank has the International Finance Corporation, which is sort of like a very large development bank, sort of like the DFC. And they do provide, I was just meeting, the meeting that I had before that forced me to be in a car was with a group that's working with the IFC to create a fund that will finance impact enterprises through local banks in Africa. And that fund, which would be supported by the IFC, is also attracting some money from both private foundations and private investors, and would be working with the private sector in Africa. So I would say it does work. You got to work it through organizations like the IFC or DFC that understand what the needs of the private sector are. You got to avoid being too overly burdensome with your requirements and regulations. Although obviously, because these are public institutions, they do have a fair bit of red tape and requirements you have to go, and you have to make sure that you're allowing the entrepreneur, the person who really understands the business, drive the process. When I look back at DFC, at the things we did that didn't work out, usually it was because we were trying to push the project instead of having the project be something, instead of being pulled into it by an entrepreneur. I'd say the other things that tended to mark our failures, and this is true at my company today, is where we really didn't understand the local context, or the entrepreneur didn't really understand the local context. And then where events sort of turned against us, and we just didn't have the financial wherewithal to ride those out.
John Simon, I'm reluctant to let you go. I've got lots more to get out of you. I guess you have a meeting at 11 or something. Yeah. We're very grateful. We'll take you for 3 hours at some point in the future.
My pleasure,
this is great. Okay.
Great
Thanks,
to be
John.
on, and
Many-
nice to meet you all, and look forward to coming back.
He's coming back. He just committed himself. Thank you, John. For the others on the call, you're now immersed. I mean, this was, I don't understand all of this, and I'm guessing you don't either. When I went to a talk a couple of weeks ago, the managing director of the World Bank, a man named von Trotzenberg, I was surprised when he directed almost 90% of his comments towards Africa. Now, John Simon is talking about the IFC, which is basically the branch of the World Bank that works with the poorest countries, the ones that have the greatest needs and that do not have a good record of credit, a good record of paying back loans. And so the bank has evolved. It's a very complex thing. I know that you all know that. We could have a session at some point just on the history and the functions of the different elements of the bank. The IFC is the part of the bank that concentrates on the countries that are the most needy. The International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, which was set up in the Bretton Woods process in 1945, the idea was Europe is destroyed. We have to reconstruct Europe. And that was the beginning point of the existence of the bank. It was the IBRD. Now, within a very short time, they realized the many challenges in Europe in post-World War II Europe, where all countries were damaged and destroyed. They realized some years later, well, there's the rest of the world also that has needs. We do care about humanity. We want, if you want to think of it in cynical terms, we want poor countries' economies to improve because then they become markets for rich countries. So it's a win-win if everybody's level goes up. So the IFC was created, I don't know if you could say purely from altruism, but the idea was the very poor countries, and most of them are in Africa, are in great need of assistance. So we will give them grants and not make them pay back. We will also give them zero interest loans. And so this is a totally different concept. The countries, the so-called middle income countries, like the ones he mentioned, Honduras, some of the countries in Latin America that have an economy, it's not a strong economy, but they're not at the lowest level. Those countries would get loans from the IBRD, which they would have to repay. Now, and John talked about political risk insurance. Peterson will get to that in a moment. Commonly is seen in there are strings attached. No, exactly. And I want to hear your comment on that in just a moment. Let me just try to describe this complex structure. The bank, it mainly exists for countries in need. I think you all know this, but it's so complicated. I'm always losing track, and then I relearn these things. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, really just works with regulating currencies. When currencies suddenly lose all their value, as has happened in Mexico and Argentina, these are not very poor countries, but sometimes their currencies will be in trouble. And the IMF then exists to try to assist in regulating a currency failure. Again, the idea is if the entire world can have generally a rising level of investment and well-being of people, it benefits everybody. It's both altruistic and it's also motivated by common interests. Peterson or whoever that was using his line, could you come on and tell us from an African point of view? You talk about strings attached, and I know that's a very sensitive topic in developing countries. You are calling in from Kenya. Would you like to explain yourself? Because you can do it better than I can. Go ahead, you're on.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
Yes.
Maybe what I was thinking about as this ambassador was talking about is that the issue of development assistance and aid cooperation and how it's transmitted, and some of the issues that arise is that there is often strings attached towards what you need to do or the requirements that you need to meet. And some of these strings or these conditions are not really necessarily that important, or let's say they're not perceived as important, or they are at loggerheads with us, with whatever we are trying to achieve. Now, for example, I know it's not really within the purview, but the recent story that is trending is that Uganda has been kicked off from AGOA, and that is due to whatever is happening there with um, their anti-LGBT and gay rights kind of thing. And from maybe an East African community perspective, is that is it really fair to conflate these things and maybe tie them together in that kind of way? Because if we are to go by that, then I think there is a lot of things that would miss off the mark. Because now, as you had said, there's a guy from Togo telling me that I hate the government. Maybe I don't even like them, but now I have to suffer because I can't access the American market of AGOA because of policies
Yeah,
they have put in place.
that's
Is
it.
that really fair? Maybe just something I thought about.
No, I thank you for that. And you've brilliantly explained the receiving end, let's call it the receiving end, in a world with rich countries, middle income countries, and poor countries. This is a built-in um, discrepancy which has never been solved and never will be solved. And what we're talking about, thank you, Peterson, is and John addressed this, when a wealthy country or the World Bank comes into a poor country, who decides what will happen? Bill Easterly will argue, if you are in a country that is not a democracy, you're wasting your money. It'll all be wasted. We've just heard from a Kenyan speaker just now, the sensitivity towards the World Bank or bilateral aid missions that come in and say, we think you need water improvement or you need electricity, but who sets the agenda? Those who are receiving the loan or the grant are there's a long history of them being very angry at being excluded from the decision-making process. That's what the Millennium Challenge Corporation tried to resolve, as I understand it. Once a country has met a threshold of democracy and free economy, then it's 50-50. It's 50-50, and it really is. The donor country and the receiving country have equal say over how the money will be used. There's an inevitable tension between those who have money and who say, this is my money. You can't do anything with it. I can't just give it to you. I need to do something. I need to be sure that there will be some responsibility in implementing this project. The recipient country will tend to say, you've got the money, we don't have the money. We know what we need and we can tell you. So I hope everybody realizes this is a tension which will always exist. Now, the speaker mentioned AGOA. For those not familiar, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, passed by Congress in the year 2000. Bill Clinton happened to be president at that time. It wasn't really a Clinton thing. It was a congressional action, which didn't create money, but what it did was lower the tariffs on African products coming into the United States. And just by that simple act of lowering tariffs, that becomes an aid instrument. Now, AGOA, which has to be renewed every 2 years and may not be renewed in 2025, AGOA is a great blessing to a country that's exporting things. It creates wealth in a poor country that exports items to the United States where there's a lower tariff or no tariff at all. Now, this was a great and noble thing. As the speaker reminded us, Uganda was now excluded. AGOA also has standards that countries are obliged to meet. If a country becomes a dictatorship, the Congress in the United States will tend to say, well, you've decided to become an anti-democratic country. Uganda recently, a decade ago, Uganda was, I think, a pretty good example of a democracy, but the democratic process has certainly declined in Uganda. And so the US Congress, noticing that, said, well, we're going to punish you. We're going to remove your AGOA privileges. You're welcome to export things to the US, but the tariffs will remain. So even AGOA is something of an outside influence on a country. Countries will always resent limits and standards. They will say, you're rich, we're poor, just help us. So these two points of view are always in conflict. I think it's a healthy conflict because donors certainly are entitled to knowing that the money they're giving or lending is not being given recklessly, that it's being given for a specific purpose with a chance of success. It's perfectly fair for an investor to have some assurance of that, whereas the recipient doesn't care about that. The recipient desperately needs some help. Peterson adds, some African leaders, lost your, can you, let's see, chat. I don't see the chat function. Can you come on and tell us what you just posted? Because I don't see it. Was that Peterson? A chat. Oh, okay. I
Yes,
see. Sorry, I see it now.
maybe just wanted to say
Commonly,
that.
it's seen or understood as, let's see. Does everybody see the chat? African leaders once stated that when Africans ask for assistance from the West, they get lectures. But when they ask for assistance from China, they get roads and schools. Brilliant, brilliant. And that's another intrinsic conflict. Western investors and donors are very, very certain that they want to see that the conditions in the country they're working in are basically okay, that the people are not being punished by their governments. If their governments are abusive, the donors from the West will say, we'll see you when you improve conditions. Whereas China doesn't care about about good governance. I mean, it really doesn't. And China is much more pragmatic and transactional, and they will come in and either conduct a project or sometimes they work under contract. China does not invest much in Africa, but their commerce way outweighs all the others. And China removes the element of discerning which country is behaving well, which government. Abisage has an addition to this. Please come in. This is fascinating.
Thank you, Dan.
Yes.
You can
Yes,
hear me?
we see you. We hear you. This is great to have Kenyans responding to John Simon. This is great.
Thanks. I want to give credit to the US for the PEPFAR fund because I have been able to work with the University of Maryland that was receiving PEPFAR fund and supporting projects here in Kenya since 2003, and it still goes on. It evolves, it keeps on evolving. The names keep changing, but it's still University of Maryland. And HIV and AIDS has been a death sentence. It was a death sentence for Africa. And were it not for the PEPFAR Fund, because we worked at the grassroots. We didn't work majorly at the national levels. We went deep into the grassroots. And I was at the most prevalent areas, that is Nyanza, is a region in Kenya, Western and Nyanza. And I was on the ground for 3 years. And by the time we shifted from county to county, I would say once the preference went down, if we say the preference goes down in Kisii County, we would close shop in Kisii County and move to Homa Bay. Because the people in Kisii County would have known how to prevent mother-to-child infection.
Transmission, yeah.
They would be aware of all these PrEP and PEP and the way you protect yourself if you have a spouse who is positive and you're not. And the impact is felt. The impact was felt and the numbers went down. Our prevalence went down low, almost to zero. And right now, a testimony, it is almost, the transmission is not as much as it was before we started working with the PEPFAR Fund. It has its challenges of, being cut and moving. While it moves from county to county, they reduce it. But that is one thing that I would give up I would give a big up to the USA, that state, specifically the State Department that was supporting through the PEPFAR fund.
Thank you,
I,
Abisage. Yep.
I didn't see any requests to match the fund.
Yeah.
I didn't see any requests. There was a need for accountability, but there was not much tagged to it because this was people's life, was health.
Thank you. I'll transmit to the American people your thanks, Abisage. For those, if this is new to some people, PEPFAR, President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. This is the program that was created by George W. Bush when a group came to him appealing for help. They asked for $3 billion. President Bush was so moved by the concept that he gave $20 billion. And Abisage points out all of Africa. It was mainly Southern Africa, which was the most affected by HIV/AIDS. Terrible, terrible numbers in South Africa and its neighboring countries. Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, the whole area was in a terrible crisis. And PEPFAR, what does it do? It provides antiretrovirals. I mean, now that there's a technology which can suppress the symptoms, very often the recipient may have the AIDS virus, may carry the virus, but be positive, be relieved of the symptoms and not die. Dying from AIDS is a horrible thing. So that's, as I think I mentioned before, Africans, I believe universally, they're very grateful, as Abisage has just said, because there really was no way of treating this. There were many public information campaigns. Here's what you need to do not to get AIDS. Very few people were following that advice. And then science came up with this thing called antiretrovirals, and it changed considerably the whole picture. Abisage reminds us, we're not finished with this crisis. The numbers are where we want them. The numbers have gone down, but it's still there, and it could come back at any time. Let's see, the person, yeah. Does Peterson or somebody want to explain more about the contrast between Western donors and Chinese? The Chinese are not donors, actually. They are transactional actors. The African continent, I think, has benefited tremendously from cheap Chinese items. The lower middle class in Africa, people who have enough money to buy a cooking pot or to buy, I don't know, a rudimentary stove or something like that. China supplies what they need, and this is mainly this is a benefit to Africa, as one of our members has pointed out. When China gets involved in large development projects, there is bribery, there is waste, and the African governments, when they're not ideal governments, they say, sure, we'll do that, we'll do that. Does it benefit all Africans? Well, there's a lot of debate about this. If a donor has a policy of not even taking into account the governance, the existence of bribes and embezzlement, this does cause a problem on the one hand. On the other hand, it does get things done. The roads are built, the railroad, the roads, the railroads, China actually built the building in Addis Ababa where the African Union meets. They did not do this from altruism. They did it from interest. But as we talked about earlier, Hans Morgenthau would have said, that's exactly right. You do what is in your national interest. Morality exists as an abstraction, but don't rely on it as an instrument of furthering your national interest. Guys, we're on a very different topic. I hope this is of some value. My wish was in the fall, we're sticking strictly with tactic, strategy, crisis management. And as you see in the spring series, we're looking at entirely different things just because I think it opens our horizons. And in that regard, let me tell you, yeah, next week is we'll have my friend Tai Sun, who is a passport holder of the People's Republic of China, but he's lived in the United States for, I think, 20 years, and he teaches political science at Christopher Newport University, which is one of the public universities in the state of Virginia. He is Chinese. He's very conversant in how Western governments and intellectuals approach problems very differently from China. And he's going to talk to us next Monday on China-Taiwan, a very sensitive potential crisis. There are a lot of observers and analysts who say a conflict is inevitable between PRC, the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan. We see aggressive military posture on the part of PRC. We don't know if they're bluffing. We don't know if they really intend someday to go across the water and to seize Taiwan, which is very Western oriented. We have a bad precedent in Hong Kong, which was independent of the Chinese government. And then when the British lease on that protectorate, when it ran out, the British government said, okay, our stay is over. Do you promise, China, that you will allow Hong Kong a measure of freedom of information, democracy? And they said, yes, we promised. China has certainly degraded the democratic status of Hong Kong. If they ever invaded Taiwan, they would certainly do the same. Now that's a doomsday scenario. We don't know if that will happen. We don't know when it might happen. It's a much discussed topic. Tai Sun, in the way I see his thinking, he's a perfect balance between the legitimate interests of the government of China and the wish in the West to grant as much freedom as possible to Taiwan. We all know the issue. The one China policy states that it insists that countries that have relations with the People's Republic, that is most countries, it insists that they have no official relations with Taiwan because they say that is China. I think you're all familiar. Now, Tai has also done work on, when we say censorship, it sounds simple. It's not simple at all. The Chinese government, when it imposes censorship, it does it very indirectly by giving signals to its private sector to temporarily or permanently silence a certain aspect of what's on the internet. They're extremely sophisticated in doing this. Tai has figured out how it works, and he might be willing to tell us about that. He also, I doubt if he'll have time to talk about this, so I'll tell you in just a minute, in 1 minute. After one of the terrible earthquakes in Sichuan province, I think 8 years ago, he took a team to that province. He's a social science scientist, and he took a team of social scientists to that province that had just suffered a horrible earthquake. And his question of many people that he interviewed was, when there's a natural disaster, where do you turn? Whom do you trust? And the choices were the central government, the local government, the extended family, the non-government organizations, and the nuclear family. Does anyone want to guess which of these five came out way on top? China is a very different country. Anyone want to guess? What Tai found was that universally, Chinese citizens most trusted their national government. Isn't that what you would least expect? In most places in the world, if there's a natural disaster, you look to your nuclear family, your extended family, your local government. And so in China, it's the exact opposite. And this is a cultural thing. It's not only a political thing. There's something about the Chinese culture where in times of stress and crisis and need, people look to the highest level with confidence in that. So Tai is able, with me, he's been able to challenge these ideas that I always had, that a civil society, that's a universal concept, that people in their communities work on problems because they don't trust the authorities in their central government. In China, it's the exact opposite. So Tai is a very interesting guy, and I look forward to his talk. The following week, challenged by some of you, I will pursue a bit more of the PowerPoint that we started today. I just think it's interesting. It's very America-centric because it's Reinhold Niebuhr, Brent Scowcroft, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Robert Gates, who talked with us last fall, and a few others. It's not really a very organized talk in the sense that these people are not disciples of Kennan, but they're very aware of Kennan. Now, John Simon challenged my idea that that the Bush administration was largely realist and internationalist. He said, no, there was a lot of idealism there. We don't think of his advisors, Richard Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, as idealists, but Bush himself, that's why I had the question marks next to his name. Bush himself was kind of an idealist. And the point of my graphs that we talked about briefly is these are ways of thinking. It's dangerous to categorize a person as one or the other. We all have elements of all four of these, but thinking of them, it's just helpful, I think, in thinking about what motivates a foreign policy actor or a policy maker. What motivates them? It will always be a combination of these four things: idealism, realism, interventionism, isolationism. I would argue with John, I believe that neoconservatism cannot easily be placed in that graph. I'm not trying to be overly academic. It's just, it helps us understand and even predict what a influential leader might do during a moment of crisis. I'm pursuing Alexei Reznikov. I don't know if that's going to work. On February 26th, we'll have Luke Coffey, who is a Ukraine-Russian scholar at the Hudson Institute. He's very knowledgeable. He testifies in Congress regularly, and we can get an update from him on this horrible situation that, well, the war, and especially in eastern Ukraine. Nobody knows really, truly in what direction this is going. The US Congress has failed to come up with a solution that would help Ukraine. Some of us are very angry about that. I am very angry. Does that actually change the dynamic of this conflict? Can anything be done about it? Will the recent $50 billion promised by the European Union, will that be a game changer? It's mostly, I think, for infrastructure and for keeping the civil service going in Ukraine, and less to do with defense. But Luke Coffey is studying this very closely, and he'll join us in 2 or 3 weeks. I welcome any comments. We've gone an hour and a half, and I don't want to exhaust you, and some of you have things to do. Anything? I'm so glad that we talked a little bit about Africa and the donor community, the various philosophies that come into conflict and always will. Who decides? The donor, the recipient? Will it be equal parts of both, which is what the MCC does? They really are 50-50. Once the US government determines you've met a threshold, they meet They go to the country, they meet with the aid officials there, and 50-50, they decide the agenda of the use of rather large grants, like $5 billion, if a country's fortunate enough to get an MCC grant. But this is a minority of countries. We have gone into many topics today. I hope some of it has been useful. And again, I welcome any comments. If lacking them, Winnie Rugut, who are you? Are you? Let's hear what you have to say, and tell us where you're calling from. I've just clicked ask to unmute, Winnie Rugut. Are you able to unmute? Folks, there's a software issue here. The Zoom platform has a link that says ask to unmute. I'm clicking that and it's not working. I'm sorry, Winnie Rugut. Please have your comments ready for next week or send me an email, and I promise we'll get to whatever's on your mind. I see that you're not able to unmute. I say goodbye to everybody. It's been great. You know, there aren't many of us, but we're good. And we are, Susan Golden do you have a comment? No, okay. Everybody, this is Susan Golden, a remarkable intellect and activist in many areas of all places, Cleveland, Ohio, in the United States. Good to see you and your many diplomas, Susan. Maybe Susan will share with us sometime how she was so successful as a fundraiser for nonprofits. She raised many millions of dollars for nonprofits in the northeastern part of Ohio. And we love you, and we want to hear from you at a future session. Thank you. Thank you.